January 17, 1943. Norfolk Naval Testing Annex, Virginia. The wind came in off the Atlantic like a blunt instrument, rattling sheet metal and carrying the salted cold straight through the thin walls of the outer warehouses. Behind those warehouses, hidden from the main rail line and unmarked on any public map, a low concrete structure pulsed faintly with electrical hum and furnace glow. Inside that building, long before most of the base had stirred awake, a man entered alone. No roster carried his name. No badge recognized by rank identified him. To the officers who passed his door without stopping, he was referred to only as the Metallurgist. He hung his overcoat on a single iron hook driven into the wall and rolled his sleeves without ceremony. His hands were already scarred from heat and chemical burn, the skin darkened and permanently stained. He worked in silence, checking gauges that ticked steadily upward, adjusting valves by instinct rather than sight. The furnace before him glowed a muted orange, its heat curling against the cold concrete like a restrained animal. Please, before we go more deeper, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you are watching from anywhere around the world. On a reinforced stand opposite the furnace stood a single steel test plate. It was taller than a door and thicker than a man's chest. To any untrained eye, it looked no different from the dozens that had failed here before. But to the man standing before it, the plate carried months of invisible decisions. Fractional temperature shifts, cooling rates controlled to tenths of a second, impurities measured in dust. The kind of details most men ignored as meaningless. The Navy had given him 6 months. He was now in his 9th. Twice, review boards had dismissed his projections as theoretical overreach. Twice, funding had been cut and quietly restored at lower levels. Too unstable, too expensive, too unpredictable. The steel he described did not behave the way naval steel was supposed to behave. Its grain structure moved under stress. Its fracture patterns refused to match established physics. To men trained in rigid formulas and predictable tolerances, it looked like fantasy built on numbers. Still, every night he returned. Not because he was ordered to, because the numbers would not leave him alone. Beyond the walls of the annex, the war followed louder paths. In Europe, armored columns tore through frozen countryside. Bomber streams carried fire into cities that glowed through the night. Newspapers carried the faces of generals in bold print, and among them, the name of George S. Patton followed the front like a rolling storm. Men feared commanders like Patton because they could see what they did. They could measure his speed. They could trace the wreckage he left behind. But here, in this narrow room of humming machines and controlled fire, fear was being shaped without banners, without speeches, without witnesses. It was being shaped atom by atom. Far across the yard, in a reinforced firing pit cut into the frozen earth, a single naval shell waited in its mount. This test was listed as routine ballistic work. No press, no spectators. Only one junior officer assigned to record the results, 2 technicians, and the man behind the unseen glass, whose future now depended on physics behaving in ways it never had before. The signal lights switched from red to amber. Inside the control room, the metallurgist stood motionless. Around him, machines did what machines had always done. Steam lifted in pale coils. Currents flowed. Pressure built. He did not look at the steel plate. He stared at a narrow band of numbers scrolling across a meter mounted to the wall. The signal shifted to green. The gun fired. The sound was wrong. It was not the deep, tearing thunder of penetration, not the familiar scream of steel being split apart. It was a short, violent crack, followed by a rising metallic howl that ended too abruptly. Smoke rolled across the range and began to thin. The junior officer leaned forward. The test plate still stood. The shell had not passed through. It had not even fully deformed the surface. What remained of it lay fractured at the base of the target like blackened chalk. Inside the control room, no one spoke. The metallurgist did not move. He simply reached for his notebook and wrote a single word beneath a trembling line of figures. Repeat. If stories of hidden World War II secrets move you, Subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you are watching from anywhere around the world. 27 minutes later, the second shell was chambered under a higher charge. The angle of impact increased. The velocity climbed beyond the conservative safety margin the junior officer had been instructed to obey. His signature on the test sheet hesitated for half a second before the firing switch was armed. The second impact was louder, deeper. The plate bent under the force in a slow, visible curve that made the technicians flinch behind the glass. Then it returned. A ripple spread outward from the point of impact like a wave across dark water, dissipating without fracture. When the smoke cleared, the steel surface showed only a darkened scar. No spall, no catastrophic crack. The shell lay in fragments again, broken against a surface that should not have withstood it. The third shot was never scheduled. It was fired anyway. No entry was made in the log authorizing it. The charge was pushed well beyond standardized limits. The shell struck at a velocity that had shredded every plate tested at this range for nearly 2 years. The sound that followed rang across the annex like a struck bell. Silence followed. When the dust settled, the plate was still standing. The junior officer took 3 steps back from the glass without realizing he was moving. Inside the control room, the metallurgist closed his notebook without writing a word. Within days, the test data was reclassified. The word routine was removed from all project descriptions. A new designation replaced it. Access was quietly restricted, and in a ledger kept far from the annex, a short list of hull numbers was marked for night refit. No announcements were made. No ceremonies followed. No mention reached the press. Under the guise of standard maintenance, a small group of warships received a layer of armor that did not appear on any public specification sheet. Among those hulls was one vessel destined for legend, the USS Iowa. Officially, nothing about her had changed. Unofficially, her skin had been rewritten at the atomic level. The metallurgist never saw her sail. By the summer of 1943, the first intercepts began to circulate through quiet channels. Enemy analysts, reviewing unexplained combat anomalies at sea, used phrases that made seasoned intelligence officers uneasy. Shell failure on contact, unexpected absorption, structural survival beyond projection. One translator underlined a sentence in red and added a marginal note that would later be quietly removed. The American ship does not die. On the battlefield, fear still wore a human face. It followed commanders. It followed columns of armor. It followed men whose names were spoken in hurried briefings and whispered in captured trenches. But slowly, without ceremony, fear began to drift away from generals and towards silhouettes on the horizon. Steel was learning how to frighten, and the man who had taught it how remained unseen, working beneath humming lights in a building that carried no sign. No one told him his alloy was being studied by the enemy. No one told him his numbers were being debated in foreign command rooms. No one told him that the fear he had created was beginning to rival that of any living commander. He only knew that the furnaces were still required, and that more steel was being ordered than ever before. By early autumn of 1943, the quiet refits were finished. Steel that no specification sheet acknowledged now clung beneath painted hulls that sailed out of American ports without ceremony. On manifests, nothing had changed. To the naked eye, nothing had changed. But under the waterline, beneath layers of inertia and heat memory, the rules of naval survivability had been quietly rewritten. The metallurgist never stood on a pier to watch the ships depart. His world remained the annex, the furnaces, the testing jigs, and the endless measurements no one outside his room fully understood. Steel orders arrived without explanation. Some days the quantities doubled without warning. Other days, entire batches were recalled and destroyed before he could examine the results. Whatever direction the war was taking beyond the walls, it was shaping his workload in ways no official briefing ever explained. When the first combat report arrived, it did not come to him. It moved through intelligence channels first, then through Naval Command, then through Washington. It was labeled inconclusive, stamped with uncertainty, and quietly placed in a restricted file. A cruiser had taken direct fire at close range. The shell had struck at an angle known to punch inward with catastrophic force. Instead, it had failed. Not ricocheted. Failed. The impact scars showed compression without penetration. Metallurgical analysts could not explain it with any alloy listed in the Navy's public inventory. 2 weeks later, a second report followed. This time, a heavier shell. A closer distance. The same outcome. By November, the pattern could no longer be called coincidence. In interrogation rooms and translation offices across Allied territory, captured enemy crews began using unfamiliar language. They spoke of impact without destruction, of shells that behaved as if striking mountains instead of hulls, of explosions that should have killed entire compartments and instead left only warped metal and dazed survivors. The phrasing was inconsistent, the tone unsettled. Fear had entered their vocabulary without a clear shape. At first, intelligence officers assumed exaggeration. Sailors exaggerated under stress. They always had. But when sonar logs, damage reports, and after-action photography aligned with those same impossible descriptions, the exaggeration argument began to collapse. A single phrase appeared in 3 separate translated documents within a 10-day span. The ship does not die. In December of 1943, one of the refitted vessels passed beneath the gray veil of the North Atlantic for the first time. Among the task group was the newly completed USS Iowa, her silhouette clean against low winter cloud. She cut through heavy seas with the same profile she had always carried, her gun silent, her hull painted in ordinary camouflage. To escort commanders, she was simply another capital ship joining the rotation. To the enemy, she would soon become something else entirely. The first engagement occurred well before dawn. Radar contacts closed fast. Range collapsed. Fire erupted across black water in white blossoms. On both sides, guns spoke in familiar languages of thunder and steel. Shells crossed invisibly through darkness. Then one struck Iowa. The impact registered across decks like the blow of a giant hammer. Shock rippled through her structure from keel to superstructure. Men braced. Systems shuddered. Damage control teams moved automatically. And then nothing followed. No rupture. No flooding. No catastrophic chain reaction. When inspection teams reached the outer hull, they found a darkened crater no deeper than a man's hand. Beneath it, the reinforced layers remained intact. The shell had broken itself apart against a surface it was never meant to touch. In enemy command rooms, operators read the same signal 3 times before speaking aloud. A direct hit, confirmed at close range, had produced no kill. Fire control officers recalculated. Range tables were checked and rechecked. Gun crews were ordered to adjust. The next salvo came heavier. It failed again. If this moment just made you lean forward, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends right now and tell us where you're watching from. Within weeks, enemy tactics began to change. Engagement distances increased without explanation. Some captains broke contact entirely when certain silhouettes appeared on the horizon. Surveillance reports began to note an unfamiliar hesitancy. It was not retreat. It was avoidance. Steel was learning how to frighten. On land, the war still revolved around men. It revolved around momentum, speed, and audacity. Field commanders rose and fell with territories taken and lost. Among them, the name of George S. Patton cut across operational maps like a blade. Patton's reputation did not rely on speculation. It was built on visible collapse of enemy lines, on relentless advance that left no time to recover. The enemy feared Patton because he followed their defeats closely enough to be seen. But at sea, fear was changing address. Enemy intelligence summaries began framing naval engagements in a new way. Loss projections rose sharply when certain hull classifications appeared in reconnaissance photographs. Probability models shifted. Risk assessments widened. Commanders who had once calculated for guns and torpedoes now calculated for something they could not identify by composition. And behind that unidentified factor stood a single man who still worked without a name. The metallurgist learned of none of this through official channels. He learned only through what the furnaces demanded of him. New alloy variations were ordered with urgency that bordered on panic. Cooling curves were pushed into narrower windows. Pressure tolerances were tested at the edge of instrument capacity. He could see from the urgency alone that whatever his work had become, it was no longer theoretical. Late one night, he noticed a deviation in the scheduled composition orders. A set of proportions he had never submitted appeared on his requisition sheet. The ratios were familiar, but the source was not his own notebook. The numbers mirrored a margin calculation he had once discarded as impossible months earlier. He copied the figures to a scrap of paper and studied them in private. They were better than his own. If the unseen force behind those numbers could refine his work even further, it meant others now understood what he had only begun. At the same time, the furnaces burned hotter than ever. A quiet shift occurred inside enemy briefing rooms. Fear vocabulary hardened. Analysts stopped debating whether the American ships were anomalous and began debating how many shells it would take to overcome them. When simulations repeatedly returned the same bleak projections, another phrase began to circulate in confidence-marked margins. Avoid direct engagement. A month later, an intercepted message crossed Allied intelligence desks carrying language that had once been reserved only for battlefield commanders. The new warships inspired the same caution as the fastest American general. Fear had officially transferred. If you can feel the war changing right now, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and stay with this story. By mid-1944, enemy gunners had begun altering firing doctrines solely for the refitted ships. Instead of concentrating on penetration, they shifted toward system disruption. Instead of aiming for magazines and engine rooms, they targeted sensors and superstructures. The goal was no longer to sink these vessels quickly. It was to blind them, slow them, and isolate them from supporting groups. Even these changes produced only marginal success. And yet, the metallurgist remained invisible to the narrative the world would later tell. In Washington, discussions became quieter and shorter. Reports now traveled in sealed envelopes instead of open briefings. Once, during a late review session, a senior analyst posed a single question that brought the room to silence. How long can fear be transferred from a man to a machine before the machine becomes the greater legend? No one answered. In the autumn of 1944, a sealed memorandum crossed a restricted desk without explanation. It bore no signature at the top, only an archival seal followed by a code that had not been used since before the war. The document did not describe current operations. It did not summarize combat data. It spoke only of origin. The alloy had not begun with wartime funding. It had been discovered years earlier in civilian research. Its potential had been judged too destabilizing for commercial release. The Patton had been quietly seized under emergency authority and sealed. The work had vanished into archived silence. The metallurgist had not discovered the formula. He had rediscovered forbidden knowledge. If this hidden origin just changed everything for you, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends now and tell us where in the world you're watching from. The memorandum ended with a single directive. The project was no longer to be treated as experimental. All records were to be duplicated, compartmentalized, and redistributed under new designations. The original research trail was to be erased. The furnaces continued to burn. Steel continued to leave the annex at night. At sea, warships continued to survive what should have killed them. But in the space between official success and buried origin, a tension began to coil that no one acknowledged aloud. The metallurgist felt it even without knowledge of the memorandum. He felt it in the accelerating demands, in the narrowing tolerances, in the sudden interest from offices that had never before addressed him. Something larger than survivability was now at stake. And whatever it was being built in silence. If you are still with this story right now, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and stay with us for what history tried to erase next. February 1945 arrived with less ceremony than the winter before it. Snow fell lightly along the Atlantic yards, dusting decks that had already seen more fire than most ships would in a lifetime. The refitted hulls continued to cycle through combat zones, and their reputation now preceded them across oceans. Enemy commanders no longer needed fresh intelligence to recognize the silhouettes. They needed only the memory of shells that had failed. Across Europe, the ground war accelerated toward its conclusion. Armored thrusts carved through collapsing defenses. The fear once associated with inevitable steel columns and relentless commanders still followed men like Patton, but now it shared its throne with something less visible and far harder to challenge. At sea, fear no longer wore a human face. In the annex, the metallurgist sensed the shift without ever being briefed on it. Orders arrived faster than he could log them. New variations were demanded without explanation. Some nights, entire batches were rejected without reason and melted down before dawn. He noticed the change in the officers as well. Fewer questions, less debate, shorter instructions. Men who once sought clarification now wanted only results. The furnaces burned nearly without pause. On a night when even the guards seemed restless, a man from Washington arrived without announcement. No rank insignia, no introduction. He carried a thin folder under one arm and spoke only once inside the lab. The metallurgist listened without interrupting, then nodded and returned to work without responding. From that night forward, two parallel records began. One was kept in official channels. It tracked production, deployment, and survivability. It measured tonnage and losses. It mapped fear through equations and probability tables. It showed that a small number of warships had altered engagement behavior across entire sectors of ocean. The second record was invisible. It tracked who asked questions. By March, the intercepted enemy communications had changed tone again. Where once there had been confusion, now there was weary acceptance. They no longer debated how the American hulls survived. They debated only how long they could delay them. Engagement plans no longer aimed at destruction. They aimed at survival in the presence of what could not be killed. One translated assessment summarized the shift with brutal efficiency. The warships now command the same caution once reserved only for the most aggressive Allied commanders. Fear had completed its transfer. The metallurgist still did not know. He knew only that the steel was changing faster than before, that each new batch responded with greater elasticity under stress, that heat resistance was climbing beyond what he had once thought theoretically possible. The laws he had obeyed for decades were bending without breaking. And somewhere in the numbers, he began to notice patterns that had never existed before. They were not random. They were directional. Late in April of 1945, the first dismantling order arrived. It did not mention victory in Europe. It did not reference the approaching end of the conflict. It stated only that specific equipment within the annex was to be removed immediately and transferred to classified storage under separate authority. No explanation followed. No receiving location was listed. Within 48 hours, two entire furnace assemblies vanished from the building. The furnaces that remained continued to burn. The metallurgist walked through the quiet gaps where machines had once stood, measuring absence by memory. No officer offered explanation. No ledger reflected the removal. When he asked a technician where the equipment had gone, the man only shrugged and avoided his eyes. By early May, another order followed. Test footage was to be destroyed. He watched reels of grainy black and white impact trials feed through a projector one final time. He saw shells fail in ways no textbook could justify. He saw steel bend and recover like living tissue. When the sequence ended, an officer reached forward and cut the film without ceremony. The pieces were placed in a metal container and ignited. The metallurgist said nothing. Europe surrendered days later. Church bells rang across oceans. Newspapers printed headlines in letters larger than any shell casing. Men embraced on decks and on streets. The war that had shaped a generation gave way to a breath few believed they would ever take again. In the annex, the furnaces still burned. Victory did not end the project. It ended its visibility. In June of 1945, the metallurgist was summoned to an office he had never entered before. The room was unmarked, undecorated, and smaller than his lab. Two men waited inside. Their jackets bore no emblems. On the desk lay a single document turned face down. The words spoken there were not recorded, but the result was precise. He was being reassigned. No destination was listed. No duration was specified. No public notice would be issued. The document across the desk contained only two concrete instructions. He was to surrender all personal research notes not already archived. And he was to refrain from discussing the project under any circumstance, to any party, for the remainder of his life. He reached into his coat and placed a small notebook on the desk. It was not the only one he owned. By July, the annex began to empty. Equipment was dismantled and removed in phases. Some machines were transferred. Others were destroyed outright. The guards changed. The access lists shortened. The hours grew quieter. One night, the furnace glows dimmed for the last time. The metallurgist walked through the lab, alone. His footsteps echoed where machinery had once roared. On a rack near the far wall still leaned one final test plate, its surface scarred by three distinct impact marks. The first impact that should have destroyed it. The second that confirmed the impossible. The third that shattered established doctrine. He placed his palm against the cold steel once more. It held. By the end of summer, the annex stood dark. Its doors were sealed. Its records dispersed. No plaque marked what had happened within its walls. No report credited the man who had worked there in near invisibility for over 2 years. Across the oceans, the warships sailed on. In post-war reviews, analysts struggled to reconcile combat survival rates with pre-war modeling. Committees debated how so many ships had endured forces that should have killed them outright. The explanations offered to the public relied on crew training, tactical superior ship handling, and industrial wartime output. No official account ever mentioned the suppressed alloy. In later decades, when historians traced the arc of wartime fear, they spoke of commanders who broke the enemy's will. They spoke of rapid advances, of thunder at the front, of men whose reputations reshaped the battlefield by presence alone. They spoke of Patton as a force of nature who frightened entire armies into motion. They did not speak of the man in the annex. And yet, scattered through classified archives and redacted memoranda, a different pattern could still be found by those who knew where to look. Engagement distances grew longer wherever the refitted warships appeared. Enemy formations dispersed earlier. Risk calculations shifted without explanation. Fear once traced only through men now traced through steel. The moral dilemma left behind by the project was never resolved in any official forum. Those who authorized its suppression argued it had been hidden for humanity's protection. A material capable of altering survivability so completely, they believed, would eventually be used for purposes far beyond defense. In their view, the world was not yet ready to know it existed. Others quietly disagreed. They believed the world had already paid the price of not knowing. By the late 1950s, rumors began to surface in obscure engineering circles. Whispers of a wartime experiment that altered failure thresholds in ways never formally published. A handful of unexplained survivability studies circulated without attribution. Each time, the trail ended before it could reach its source. The metallurgist himself vanished from all accessible professional records. No obituary was found under his name. No retirement note surfaced in public rolls. No academic institution claimed him. To the world at large, he had never existed. Only the steel remained. Decades later, in a forgotten storage yard far from any ceremonial display, a rusted test plate still leaned against a concrete wall. 3 scars marked its surface. Rainwater pooled in the shallow depressions and evaporated in summer heat. Wind scoured it slowly. Time tried to erase it, but the plate held. It had held in fire. It had held in silence. And it continued to hold in obscurity. History would remember the men who moved armies. It would build legends from thunderous advances and shattered front lines. It would measure fear by the sound of boots and engines on land. But somewhere between those loud chapters, a quieter truth remained buried. That one suppressed scientist, working beyond notice, had forged a kind of fear no commander could ever generate alone. And the final question left behind by his work still has no official answer. Was the alloy buried to protect the world from itself, or to ensure that only a few would ever control what it made possible? If stories like this remind you that hidden sacrifice still shapes the world, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you're watching from around the globe.